Think your current job is bad? I mean, we all have those days, right? Your inbox is literally overflowing, or you're stuck in a meeting that definitely should have been an email, and you just want to vent. But when we contrast our modern office woes with the harsh realities and frankly the incredible demands of the past, well, our daily grind suddenly doesn't look so terrible. Because history is absolutely full of wild, extinct professions. But here's the key takeaway for us today. These weren't just random acts of madness. Not at all. These absurd-sounding jobs were actually highly logical solutions to the strict constraints of their specific eras. Think about it. When you lack modern technology, modern medicine, or, basic modern labor laws, you have to get creative. And as you'll see, that creativity sometimes took an astonishing human toll. Let's start with our first major historical problem. Section 1. The human telegraph system and speeding up ancient communication. Imagine trying to run a massive empire way back before the invention of the telegraph in 1837. You couldn't just shoot over a quick text. You had to physically transport documents across a staggering 1,700 miles. So what do? Well, the first really brilliant solution to this came from the massive Achaemenid Empire, which is often considered the first Persian empire. They built the Angarium. This was a heavily secured royal road with checkpoints set up at regular intervals. By using a clever relay system of fresh horses and station messengers, they dropped delivery times across those 1,700 miles from a completely unworkable 90 days on foot all the way down to just 7 to 9 days. That's a real game changer. And this brilliantly illustrates the huge difference geography and technology can make, especially when we contrast those Persians with the Inca Empire in the 1500s. The Persians, they had horses and they had pockets for their written messages. The Incans, however, no horses. They relied entirely on human foot power over some incredibly rough terrain. And you know what's even wilder? The Inca didn't actually have a formal written language, so this whole system was based entirely on rote memory. No pressure, right? These Incan messengers were called chasquis. And the details here are honestly just staggering. We're talking about extremely slim, fit runners who were tasked with verbally memorizing the king's exact orders. They would sprint up to 5 miles between these weather-resistant relay huts just to pass the message off to the next guy. And remember, they weren't exactly jogging on flat paved roads here. They were running up wobbly, cobbled stone paths, mostly uphill, at 10,000 feet above sea level. I mean, talk about an intense physical and mental toll, sometimes just to deliver a message like, "The king says keep up the good work."
Now we move on to a problem of a very different nature. Section 2. Swallowing sins for cash. The 17th century spiritual loophole.
So what happens when a loved one dies suddenly, and regular prayer simply isn't considered good enough to get them into heaven? Well, you needed a way to physically remove their earthly wrongdoings. Enter the local sin eater. Let's walk through this literal, very sensory-heavy ritual. Step 1. The grieving family places food, usually some stale bread and maybe some warm beer, directly onto the chest or even the face of the recently deceased. Step 2. That food supposedly absorbs all the bad juju, all the sins of the dead person. Step 3. The sin eater chows down on this incredibly morbid meal. And finally, step 4. They get their small fee and then they are immediately outcasted from the community. It was a truly tragic existence. Because they supposedly absorbed the sins of others, sin eaters were hated, ridiculed, and forced to live completely isolated lives. They basically traded their entire social standing for a few pennies and some free, albeit extremely unsanitary bread and beer. And shockingly, this practice wasn't just some ancient myth, it lasted all the way into the early 20th century. Richard Munslow, who was actually a well-loved farmer who took on the job after the tragic loss of his own children, was the last known sin eater in England. For our next section, I want to shift to a more serious tone. Section 3. Children of the Cannons and Supplying the Age of Sail. During brutal naval warfare back in the day, ships were just blasting heavy metal balls at each other. Supplying those cannons with gunpowder in the chaotic heat of battle was a massive logistical problem, and sadly, it led to the terrifying era of the powder monkeys. So the crucial point is that navies desperately needed small, quick, and agile crew members who could run gunpowder from the ship's magazine deep in the hull all the way up to the cannons. And because orphanages during the 16th to 19th centuries were completely overflowing due to disease and terrible working conditions, navies just scooped up impoverished children. They were usually 12 to 14 years old, but heartbreakingly, historical documents show cases of children as young as 7 serving in this highly dangerous role. The daily hazards these kids faced were just a visceral horror. Imagine being a child and dodging active cannon fire, carrying heavy, highly volatile explosives, all while risking blinding shrapnel and limb loss. And the kicker? Despite being entirely critical to the success of any naval skirmish, they held absolutely no formal naval rank. Zero. They endured the absolute worst horrors of war, essentially trading their entire childhoods just to secure a bed, daily food, and a very basic education.
Thankfully, societal advancements did eventually phase out this tragic necessity. Following the War of 1812, the United States formally set the minimum age limit for ships to 12. Shortly after that, the British set their limit to 13. But honestly, it really wasn't until the mid-1800s, when more comprehensive child labor laws were finally put into place and naval technology evolved, that this grim practice fully died out once and for all.
Let's pivot to another bizarre historical problem, this time from the realm of medicine. Section 4. The medieval pea tasters and diagnosing before modern science. So today, if you're sick, a doctor can just run some microscopic and chemical analyses, right? But how exactly did physicians diagnose internal illnesses before any of that modern science existed? Well, they used a practice called uroscopy. And yes, this entailed analyzing a patient's urine by sight, smell, and, brace yourselves, taste. This whole thing was rooted in the ancient medical belief of the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And you know, it wasn't just some quick medieval fad either. Historians trace this all the way back to the 4th millennium BC with the ancient Sumerians, and it's even extensively detailed in the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BC, way before hitting its absolute peak in the Middle Ages.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer level of detail in their highly subjective quick reference guides. To create at least some level of consistency, these physicians actually created detailed manuscripts. For example, clear urine meant you had spleen issues. Dark red meant your liver was basically running too hot. Green, that meant jaundice. Black, well, black usually meant you were already knocking on death's door. And hey, if the color wasn't enough to go on, they utilized taste and smell. A sweet taste pointed to diabetes, while a super stinky smell pointed to an infection.
Looking at this through a modern lens, it literally sounds insane. But, believe it or not, there was actually some validity here. They were incredibly accurate at diagnosing things like diabetes and jaundice based on these traits. But, of course, there was a massive catch. Knowing the diagnosis didn't actually help the patient. They could accurately tell you that your body was failing, sure, but they provided absolutely no effective treatment or cure for it. Let's move on to our final and perhaps most absurd historical problem. Section 5. Pets for the ultra-rich and curing the boredom of the 1700s elite. Look, when you have more money than you could possibly spend in 50 lifetimes, hunting trips and opulent balls probably get stale pretty quickly. So their solution to this extreme boredom actually began with architecture. They started building these grand English landscape gardens. They basically replaced the rigid formal gardens of the French with a sprawling, highly engineered, natural aesthetic. They built artificial lakes, perfectly manicured natural slopes, fake druid temples and grottos. It was a beautiful retreat for sure, but for some ultra-wealthy elites, all those trees and stones just weren't quite enough. They felt like something human was missing from their carefully engineered wilderness. So, what did they do? They actually hired human beings to be living decorations. No way, right? Just listen to this unbelievable quote from a job listing by Joseph Pockington. He was a 26-year-old banking heir who built his own private island. He literally demanded that a man live for 7 years without washing or cutting his hair or nails. The hired man was expected to live in an artificial cave, never speak to guests, and remain in a completely untouched, wild state as an ornamental garden hermit.
Now, if a man could successfully complete 7 years of silent, unwashed cave dwelling without breaking any of these crazy rules, he'd be paid a lump sum at the end. To put that into perspective, in today's money, that equates to roughly $100,000. Now sure, spread out over 7 years, it wasn't exactly a tech CEO's salary, but for a poor laborer struggling in the 1700s, it was a massive, completely life-changing bounty.
Let's move to and see how this builds across different estates, because honestly, not all rich people wanted a filthy, silent caveman staring at their guests. We can actually contrast the silent hermits, like Pockington's, with more interactive hermits. For example, the Hill family in Shropshire employed Father Francis, a hermit who fully interacted with guests, told stories, and dispensed this sort of rustic wisdom, basically serving as a comforting, mysterious presence in their botanical gardens. Ultimately, though, this whole bizarre trend faded out in the 1830s when the wealthy finally decided to just replace their living hermits with stone statues. Much lower maintenance, I guess.
So, having explored all these incredibly strange, now extinct professions, I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Which of our modern jobs do you think will look utterly ridiculous 500 years from now? I mean, we think sitting at a desk, typing away on our keyboards is the pinnacle of logical labor right now. But maybe, Just maybe, the historians of the future will look back at us with the exact same bewilderment we feel when we look at the sin eaters or the garden hermits. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, guys. Keep asking questions and keep learning.